This program is made possible by the support of Delta Dental, Quick Trip, Marshfield Clinic Health System, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Hospital Association. Watch Wisconsin Eye on Spectrum Channels 995 and 363 and at wisi.org.
This meeting is being recorded.
And good morning, and thank you for joining us. I just want to double check that the folks from DHS are on. Sarah Yang. And how about Roy Irving?
Hi, Jennifer. I just logged in. Are we doing introductions?
Yes, one moment. We're waiting for Sarah to join us.
It looks like she is on, Jennifer.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we can begin. And good morning, and thank you for your patience. A reminder to stay muted until you have called on to ask your question, and we'll take one question. If there's time, we'll go around again for any follow-ups. Joining us for today's briefing are Dr. Sarah Yang, a toxicologist with the DHS Bureau of Environmental and Occupational Health. Also, Dr. Gavin Daynard, a water policy fellow with the DHS Bureau of Environmental and Occupational Health. Darcy Foss, the administrator with the DNR Division of Environmental Management, and James Zelmer, the deputy administrator with the DNR Division of Environmental Management. Also available today to answer your questions are Dr. Roy Irving, the section chief with the DHS Bureau of Environmental and Occupational Health, Steve Elmore, the bureau director of the DNR Division of Environmental Management, and Lori Bowman, the bureau director of the DATCP Agrochemical Management. And we'll begin the briefing with remarks from Dr. Sarah Yang.
Hi, good morning. Jennifer, could you make me can you allow me to share my screen so I can show some slides? Real quick, thanks. All right, looks like I can.
Sarah, can you try now? You should be able to.
Okay, yes. Sorry about that weird message. Okay, so can you see my slides now?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, great. So, so I'm going to start by just talking about our groundwater standards process. So this is a process that's identified in our state statute. So Chapter 160 of Wisconsin law, and it was adopted in the 1980s. And it starts when state agencies, so agencies like the Department of Natural Resources or Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection, identify substances that are or may be in our groundwater. Once these substances have been identified, DNR requests that Department of Health Services review the substances for which there may be health concerns. We look at the available information for these substances and then develop recommended standards. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that process actually looks like in a minute. But once we have those recommended standards, DNR then proposes rules through the standard rulemaking process. Now, this recommendations that we are issuing today is the 11th cycle of groundwater standards recommendations. So this is the 11th time we have done this process since the 1980s. A little bit more about how we develop these recommendations. So we start by gathering the relevant scientific information. This can be information about health effects from federal agencies like the EPA, or information from published scientific studies. We then select an appropriate standard, and this is based on a procedure that's laid out in Chapter 160 of state statute. So this chapter actually really specifies how we can set a number to protect public health. And if you're interested in a little bit more detail about that process, we have some resources on our website, which I'll share the link with shortly. Then we document our findings and the rationale for the recommendation. And we share those recommendations with DNR, DATCP, and our partners and the public. And so this is where we are today. So we're at the end of that DHS develops recommended standards process. The next step in that process is DNR taking those recommendations and starting the rulemaking process. And I think Darcy's going to talk a little bit more about that process.
Good morning, everybody. Are you able to hear me, Sarah?
Yes, I can hear you, Darcy.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, and I want to thank each of you and my colleagues from DHS, DATCP, and the DNR for being here today. Wisconsin has a long and proud history of groundwater protection. Wisconsin's groundwater law, adopted in 1983, is held up as one of the state's and the nation's model environmental laws, in part because of its robust, science-based process for protecting the quality of our groundwater and public health. For over 37 years, this law has guided the process that DHS, DATCP, and DNR follow, ensuring a scientifically rigorous review of available technical information and clarity on how recommended groundwater standards are selected. Today marks our continued efforts towards returning Wisconsin to leadership in the field of environmental protection. You may remember Governor Tony Evers declared 2019 the year of clean drinking water. Until June of 2019, the DNR had not undertaken revisions or additions to our groundwater standards for over 10 years. Clean drinking water in Wisconsin remains a public health priority for the Evers administration in 2020, as it did in 2019. With this second set of science-based recommendations in hand, DNR will immediately begin a second round of rulemaking based on sound, up-to-date science. The DNR, DHS, and DATCP have some of the very best and brightest working together on this effort. It is our intention to roll up our sleeves and move as quickly as possible to protect our citizens and our natural resources from harmful contaminants. But we also intend to provide our businesses and local governments with clarity on how to address these emerging contaminants. Clarity in environmental standards is a fundamental principle in promoting brownfield redevelopment and helps guide our businesses in everyday business decisions. And with that, I'll turn it back to the folks at the Department of Health Services. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Gavin Dainert, and I am a Water Policy Postdoctoral Fellow with the Department of Health Services. And today I will be presenting the groundwater standard recommendations. For this cycle, DHS is recommending 22 new groundwater standards. First, DHS is recommending new groundwater standards for 6 different pesticides, all of the pesticide groundwater standard recommendations are based on health values that were established by the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, and they're shown here on the screen. As you can see, 2 of the standards are in milligrams per liter, or parts per million, and 4 are in micrograms per liter, or parts per billion. Second, DHS is recommending individual groundwater standards for 12 different per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or 12 different PFAS. Each PFAS is shown here by its chemical name and its acronym. All of the groundwater standards recommendations for individual PFAS are based on health information that was collected from available scientific studies. And again, as you can see, 7 of these standards are in micrograms per liter, or that parts per billion, and 5 of these standards are in nanograms per liter, or parts per trillion. Third, DHS is recommending a combined groundwater standard for 4 new different PFAS. We are recommending a combined groundwater standard of 20 nanograms per liter to apply to the 6 PFAS that are shown here at the bottom. NET-FOSE, NET-FOSA, NET-FOSAA, and FOSA have all been shown to turn into or biotransform into PFOS in the body and turn into PFOS and PFOA in the environment. And we know from before that PFOS and PFOA can cause negative human health effects. In June of 2019, as a part of the Cycle 10 recommendations, DHS recommended a combined standard of 20 nanograms per liter for PFOA and PFOS. And now we are recommending a combined standard for all 6 of these PFAS into a combined standard of 20 nanograms per liter. Last, DHS is not recommending individual groundwater standards for 18 different PFAS at this time. We are not recommending groundwater standards for these particular PFAS because there is limited health information that is available from scientific studies. For more information about the Cycle 11 groundwater standard recommendations and the groundwater standard process, please visit the DHS website by following the links on the screen. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jim Zelmer. I'm the Deputy Administrator for the DNR's Environmental Management Division. Groundwater is a source of drinking water for over 2/3 of Wisconsin's population. The DNR is entrusted with protecting public health through the availability of clean groundwater resources. We have an opportunity to continue moving forward in protecting our citizens and our natural resources from harmful pollutants. Today, Department of Health Services is submitting their second set of groundwater standard recommendations to us since 2019. Next, our staff will begin the process of modifying groundwater quality standards to reflect these recommendations. By law, the DNR must include the recommendations provided by DHS in its proposed rule. DNR may adjust those recommendations only after the formal public comment period on the proposed rule. That has rarely been done. Just like last year, we will again bring together stakeholders to advise our work and encourage public comments during the rule writing process. The rulemaking process takes about 30 months to complete. Once the rulemaking process is complete, these 22 new standards will be added to the state's 138 existing NR 140 groundwater standards, plus any that are added from the current rulemaking already underway. These standards are used for regulating facilities, practices, and activities that can affect groundwater quality. They apply to bottled water, how we determine whether or not to issue drinking water advisories if private drinking water wells are contaminated with these substances, approved agricultural chemicals, contamination site cleanup, regulation of solid waste landfills, and more. Our efforts to protect groundwater do not stop with the recommendations sent to us today or updating our groundwater standards in the coming months. We will continue this process on a regular basis to address all new and emerging groundwater contaminants as required by Wisconsin's groundwater law. While the DHS did not recommend standards for 18 of the 36 PFAS on the list due to limited health information, they will continue to review available, relevant, and scientifically valid information on these substances to determine if any of them should be recommended in the future. Groundwater standards are used in our daily work here at DNR. We implement a host of permitting and cleanup activities using these groundwater standards to protect the water coming out of the drinking water wells in the state. These are some of the many ways we protect public health and the environment. We want to take this opportunity to thank the scientists and health professionals at DHS for their outstanding efforts. And with that, back to our host.
Thank you, everyone. And we will now open it up to questions. A reminder to remain on mute until you're called on to ask your question to maintain the audio quality. And we'll go around once, and if we have time, we'll continue again for follow-ups. And we'll begin this morning with Susan Bentz from Milwaukee Public Radio. Susan.
Hi. What will the public comment process be and the length of that process?
Steve Elmore, did you want to take that, or I can cover it?
Sure, I can answer that. Hi, I'm Steve Elmore. I'm the director of the Drinking Water and Groundwater Program, and we will have, as Jim stated, we'll start the rulemaking process as soon as possible, and as a part of that, there are formal comment periods, both for the economic impact assessment and for the rule language itself. Those are the formal comment periods. We will also have stakeholder meetings where we discuss different aspects of the rule changes and get input through that process. On the recommendations today, there isn't, at this stage, there isn't a formal public comment period.
Thank you. Continuing on now with Ed Walters from WFRV-TV in Green Bay. Ed? Ed Walters? Okay, we'll move on then to Chris Hubbock from the Wisconsin State Journal. Chris.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about just the process of review for the ones that you did make recommendations for, as well as the ones that you felt you didn't have enough information to make recommendations for.
Sure. Sure. This is Sarah with the Department of Health Services. I can talk about that process. So again, the process is specified in Chapter 160, and it lays out the kind of information that we need to look for. So it says we have to look for federal numbers, which are typically things like a maximum contaminant level, or MCL, from the EPA, health advisories levels from the EPA. It also says that we need to look for an oral reference dose. So that's not a concentration in drinking water, but it's the amount of a chemical that could cause a health effect if we exceed that level. And we can use that with an equation that's specified in statute to calculate what that concentration would be in drinking water. It also lays out a process for us to come up with our own health-based value similar to that EPA value from peer-reviewed published literature. So for all of the PFAS that we reviewed, There are no federal numbers at this point. So the EPA does not have health advisories or drinking water standards for any of those PFAS. They do have some draft oral reference doses for 2 of the PFAS, which we did include in our review. But all of our recommendations are based on scientific studies that we found from a literature search. So doing a scientific literature search. And we use that equation that's specified in statute to protect young children. So it assumes a body weight of a young child, and it assumes how much a young child would drink of water. Now, some of the PFAS we looked at have no peer-reviewed published studies that are looking at health effects where we can take, a number and say, okay, if we're looking at this PFAS below this level, we don't think there's a health problem. And so that is kind of the limitation in the available information. As Gavin mentioned, for the pesticides, agricultural chemicals, we were able to develop recommendations for all 6 of them, and we did use information from the EPA to develop those recommendations. There are full scientific support documents for each of the groundwater standards that we developed on our webpage, as well as fact sheets for those. And then there's some information with a little bit more detail about the ones that we did not develop recommendations for.
Thank you, Chris. We'll move on to Jillian Pomplin from the Crawford County Independent and Kickapoo Scout. Jillian?
Yes, thank you for taking my question. We have seen strong evidence that nitrate is the most prevalent contaminant of groundwater in Wisconsin wells, and that indeed those levels seem to be rising. A little surprised not to see any treatment of nitrate in today's presentation, especially with the nitrate task force also moving into rulemaking. Is there any plans to reconsider, the warning level at which, nitrate impacts can be seen to be human health hazards, or the initial warning level when we start to see things moving in the wrong direction? Thank you.
Bruce, did you want to take that?
Sure. This is Bruce Rheineck, Groundwater Section Chief with the Department of Natural Resources. And I can take part of it, and some of it may also go back to Department of Health Services. But for today's group, we were looking at new contaminants, or ones for which we understood there may be health information to set a standard. And Cycle 10 also included a review of some compounds for which there appeared to be new scientific information suggesting a different standard. But I'll pass it over to health to confirm. But at this point, we already have an existing NR 140 enforcement standard for nitrate. And I know people keep studying nitrate, but I've been unaware of anything at this point that would cause a change in the enforcement standard that we have. But that is something we do keep looking at. And as part of Cycle 10, we did request re-review of some existing standards. And so that's always a possibility if we become aware of new information that would cause us to take a look again at an existing enforcement standard.
This is Sarah with DHS. I can chime in. So again, as we mentioned, today's review, today's release is really about these recommendations that we were asked to look at by DNR. We were asked to look at 40 substances. Nitrate was not one of those 40 substances. That's not to say that DHS is not regularly involved in messaging about nitrate and health effects, and trying to, make sure that we are doing as much as we can to protect people from nitrate, as well as other, existing groundwater contaminants. We do continue to learn more about nitrate, but at this point, there hasn't been enough new information to trigger a review. That might be something, that we have some discussions with DNR about in the future as we move forward with the groundwater rulemaking process and future groundwater standards.
Thank you, Jillian. Now to Amber from Bay Cities Radio in Marinette. Amber? And again, Amber from Bay Cities Radio. We'll move on then to Evan Vogel from TMJ4 in Milwaukee. Evan? TMJ4, do you have a question? Then we'll move on to Julian Emerson from Up North News. Julian. And once more, Julian Emerson from Up North News. Okay, moving on then to Fox 11 in Green Bay. Fox 11. Moving on then to Jonathan Nizer from NBC 26. Jonathan.
Yes, thanks for taking the time today. I had kind of two quick questions. One, when the word PFAS comes up, my knowledge and understanding of that kind of ties back to the issues up in the Marinette area where the firefighting foam was an issue a while back. Does anything that was developed or discussed today have any ties to that or impact that in any way?
This is Darcy Foss. I think one of the things that, and I'll let Steve Elmore jump in here and Jim Zelmer, it does affect is if we have private well data from up there where we had a recommendation in the past, in the last year from our Department of Health Services on two of those PFAS substances, PFOA and PFOS. And then if we found that in people's wells at 20 or above, we were either providing water or Johnson Controls up in the Marinette Peshtigo was providing water. Now Department of Health has given us additional compounds that have health advice associated with them, and we would be looking then at those private well data, because a lot of them already have sampled for these compounds, to see if those compounds also appeared. And for example, if we didn't have PFOA or PFOS as a concern, but we did have those other compounds at a level of concern, then we would look to provide some advice on drinking that water. So it could, in fact, impact that area and other areas of the state where we've taken private well samples or public for those PFAS compounds recommended by DHS. And I'll let either DHS jump in or one of the DNR staff.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add to what Darcy had said. As she stated, some of the recommendations that we received today from DHS are constituents that are found in the firefighting foam. So we'll be evaluating groundwater monitoring results that we have in-house, and we'll be advising the well owners, as far as possible health effects related to that.
Thank you, Jonathan.
This is Sarah. I was going to just add one more comment to that. Sure. So another piece of information that we have available for people, and I think you got in a packet, is fact sheets. So for each recommendation, we have a scientific support document, but we also have a fact sheet for homeowners, private well users, to kind of recommend what they should do if we do find that PFAS in their water. So that's another resource we have available.
Thank you. And thank you, Jonathan. Moving on to Spectrum News 1. Spectrum? And I believe that's Jeffrey from Spectrum. Are you available? Okay, moving on then to Brad Williams from WIZM Radio in La Crosse. Brad? Brad Williams from WIZM. Okay, moving on then to Stephen Joyce from Bloomberg. Stephen.
Yeah, my question is on the limits themselves. One column is for preventative action. I'm wondering if that's a statutory term or is it a regulatory term? Someone can define that for me. And secondly, on the enforcement penalties, are they already ensconced in NR 160 or is that something that's going to have to be developed? And what are the penalties involved? Thank you.
Bruce, do you want to cover that?
Sure. Again, this is Bruce Rheineck. I can take pieces of that. Yes, both the enforcement standards and preventative action limits are described in statute. The enforcement standards are human health based numbers, and in existing code NR 140, you can find the range of actions that can be taken by programs for both an enforcement standard exceedance and a preventative action limit exceedance. The concept behind the preventative action limit is more of an early warning for programs. So solid waste landfills or cleanup sites to start getting a handle on the situation before you would get to a human health-based exceedance in groundwater. So there's a larger range of actions when you exceed a preventative action limit, from no action to a lot of actions to address the problem. But the actions selected really depend on the regulations in place which regulate that activity. So, you have the action can fit a solid waste facility isn't necessarily the same as a spill site. So programs have their own steps to take, but everybody is evaluating data and having the same target of keeping groundwater clean. But how you get there and how you keep groundwater clean depends on the activity and the other regulations in place around that activity. Anyone else can jump in and if I missed part of the question. But thanks for that question.
Hearing none, we'll move on then to Lane Kimball from WISC TV in Madison. Lane? Again, Lane Kimball from News 3 Now. Lane? Okay, we do have time to go around again to see if you have any follow-up questions, and we'll begin at the top of the list, again with Susan Benz from Milwaukee Public Radio. Susan?
Thank you. How does the announcement, the PFAS portion of these groundwater standards that are being covered today, how do those overlap with the work that the PFAS task force is carrying out? I assume this is a question for Darcy, and I believe the task force is expected to be reporting to the governor, I think, at the end of this year, along with the state legislature. So what is that group doing that what you're discussing today doesn't?
Well, that's a good question, and I know Mimi Johnson is on as well today. So if I don't get this quite right, Mimi can help me out. But I think really the task force is letting the regulatory process move ahead. Certainly, we the task force is supporting the efforts that are going underway and the efforts of both the DNR to make the request to DHS, but also support for DHS and their staff and in making those recommendations. I do think what the task force also said was that as these recommendations come in for these new PFAS standards for groundwater. The task force recommendation was in draft right now, and we're finalizing that report as we speak, is that our other parts of our programs, our drinking water and our surface water program, should also be looking at that science and seeing how that would then work into how we could set potentially additional drinking water standards or additional surface water standards. But really our focus today, rightfully, is on moving ahead with those groundwater standards. That's very clear and promulgated. But I think your question's a good one. How does the task force recommendation impact that? And that's just says to continue looking at your other media, surface water, soil, air, etc., and looking at how this would fit into that. So I think that is, maybe the clearest answer how WISPAC recommendations fall there.
Thank you for that, Susan. Now to Spectrum News 1, who didn't have a chance to ask a question before. Jeffrey, are you available?
Yes, hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Go ahead, please.
I'm so sorry about that. Thank you so much for holding this call. I think that someone might have asked this question. I froze up, but as far as enforcement goes, where does this put, I know there's a rulemaking process, but where does having these standards put any state agency on enforcement, and which state agency would be enforcing the PFAS rules? And also, sorry for another, is it enforced only when it's in water with a contamination, or would it be enforced on the front end if some of these chemicals are being used for other types of production?
Well, this is Darcy. I think what happens is that sometimes we get that term enforcement standard versus preventive action limit kind of mixed up with an enforcement process involving the Department of Justice or something like that. So I like to think of the preventive action limit as the fire alarm on my mom's kitchen wall. If it goes off, either her toaster is burning the toast, or there's really a fire in the house, or maybe there's nothing going on and it just went off again. And the preventive action limit is basically just a early warning system that says, hey, we need to look at what's happening here. Is our facility not working? Is the spreading of this material starting to cause a problem? The groundwater enforcement standards are really kind of based on what Sarah mentioned today. Those are those human public health standards that we really don't want a facility to create a groundwater problem that leads up to that, or if we have a groundwater problem from some historical use, we're going to clean up at least to that level to make sure that whatever groundwater is there, it's protective of being consumed and drank as potable water. So, and if somebody won't do that, then we use enforcement. But I think that those words, enforcement standards, are a little misleading, because it's really the health-based level that we want to prevent people from reaching, but also if we have a problem, they need to at least clean up to that. So I hope that helps answer your question, Jeffrey.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Once again, to Ed Walters from WFRV in Green Bay. Ed? Moving on then to Chris Hubbock from the Wisconsin State Journal. Chris, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I wonder if you could just clarify on the 20 part per trillion combined standard. I think, Gavin, you said 6 PFAS compounds, but I'm just trying to clarify. I know that there was the previous recommendation of 20 parts per trillion for just PFOA and PFOS. Can you just elaborate on which 6 they are?
Yeah, I think Sarah's going to pull it up, but just so I can say them. So there's 6 of them now. It'll be NEET, FOSE, NETFOSAA, NETFOSA, FOSA. Those are the 4 new ones. And then they're being combined with PFOA and PFOS at the 20. And so it's the 4 in the black boxes and the 2 in the blue boxes.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Trying again for Amber from Bay Cities Radio and Marinette. Amber, are you with us? Okay, moving on to Evan Vogel from TMJ4. Moving on to Julian Emerson from Up North News. Julian. Okay, moving on to Jillian Pomplin from the Crawford County Independent and Kickapoo Scout. Jillian, do you have a follow-up? Again, Jillian Pomplin. Okay, moving on then to Jonathan Nizer from NBC 26. Jonathan? Jonathan Nizer, do you have a follow-up? Okay, moving on then to Brad Williams from WIZM Radio in La Crosse. Brad, are you available? Okay, we'll go back then to Stephen Joyce from Bloomberg. Stephen, do you have a follow-up?
I do. I want to follow up on something that Jeffrey asked. So, Darcy, if I understood you correctly, the enforcement mechanism will be both for legacy and current industry. In other words, if there is contamination in the soil, for instance, or in the ground, or sort of a standing water, body of water, but there's no production going on, that would apply, that could be enforced. And also, if you have an existing plant that's actually producing something, that would also fall under the regime. Is that correct?
Yeah, and Bruce can jump in here too. And I think that what makes the state's groundwater law so unique back in 1983, it really was both a preventive law, a law to prevent new releases and new harm to the groundwater, which is why you have those two, you have your Sentry kind of thing, your trigger, which is that preventive action level, that PAL, and then something you really don't want to get to, which is the enforcement standard. And so it does apply to facilities and sites or practices or activities such as land spreading of materials or something like that. We don't want to cause a problem, but also if we have a historic landfill situation, an old brownfields redevelopment where there's a property transaction going on, somebody puts some monitoring wells in the ground and finds PFAS contamination at a certain level, those help guide on what we should be doing there for soil and groundwater remedy there. So this is really about groundwater, not so much surface water at this point, but that's how it applies both as a historic thing to clean up to, but also to prevent damage to our groundwater.
Thank you, Darcy. This is Bruce. I would just add to that really what we're doing here with setting these standards is setting a clear, uniform standard for all activities to meet. And then if you're not meeting that, this rule in itself leaves a lot of flexibility for the permitting process or whatever else in how to achieve getting back under that enforcement standard, or how to keep it if you're above the preventative action limit, about how to keep it from keeping on going up. So it doesn't prescribe a particular way to get there. It just says the program and the activity have to figure out how to get there.
Thank you. Moving on then to Lane Kimball from WISC TV in Madison. Lane, are you available? Once again, Lane Kimball. Okay, well then that concludes today's media briefing. You can find additional information on the DHS and DNR websites. Thank you for joining us this morning, and be safe and have a good weekend.
This program is a production of Wisconsin Eye, an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit media network with a mission to inform, educate, and engage the citizens of Wisconsin. Wisconsin Eye is the nation's first and only independently funded state civics broadcast network, providing gavel-to-gavel access to government proceedings and events at the state capitol.